So welcome to the webinar, Get Your Novel Editor Ready. My name's Andrew Hodges, and I'll be co-hosting this webinar with Claire Cronshaw. So before we start, I'll say a few words about myself, and then Claire will do the same. And if you have any technical issues at any point, just pop a message in the chat and we'll get back to you. So my name's Andrew Hodges. I have been a fiction developmental and line editor for 5 years full-time and 10 years if you include part-time work before that. I used to work as a cultural anthropologist before, and that's why I'm really interested in fiction projects that are focused on context and setting and world building, and that's particularly attracted me to science fiction, fantasy fiction, and also some literary fiction as well, books that explore settings in unusual and interesting ways. Besides doing fiction, so I do fiction developmental editing for authors who are preparing to query with literary agents, and also for authors who are planning on self-publishing. If you're not familiar with the distinction, we'll talk more about that later, so don't worry. And I also copy edit young adult fiction for Penguin Random House USA. And that's really interesting because it gives me a bunch of insights into what very polished books look like as well, and also what's hot and what's not in the market, which is a consideration if you're querying with traditional publishers. Okay, over to Claire.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire Cronshaw and my business is called Cherry Edits. I used to be a Cherry, it was my maiden name, so that's where that name's come from, Cherry Edits. So I am a fiction line and copy editor. I also proofread as well. Now, I just work with, I should say, work with indie authors and self-publishing authors. I work with quite a lot of authors who are early career authors, I would say, and I support them to make their manuscripts better with line and copy editing. I'm a former English teacher. I was an English teacher in secondary schools for 18 years and then retrained into editing and proofreading. And these days, my main genres that I tend to work on, I get a lot of fantasy. I love fantasy, a bit of sci-fi, and I get quite a bit of women's fiction and romance. And just recently, cozy crime has been I've had a few more cozy crime jobs in the last 18 months or so as well. So they're kind of my main genres that I work on. And yeah, so hopefully through, I offer something a bit different to Andy because of the way that who we're working with essentially and where the authors are within their writing careers. So you'll get a bit of both today. Okay, thanks, Andy.
Okay, Claire.
So what we're going to look at now is just a quick overview of this evening's session. So Andy's going to talk you through the publishing process and where new authors often come unstuck. He's then going to do some content on perspective and POV. After that, I'll come back on and I'll be talking about showing and telling, and we'll look at a checklist of whether your novel is editor ready. We'll then find out about an opportunity to learn more, of getting more support from us, and that's from a storytelling coaching course that we'll give you a brief overview of. After that point, it'll be cameras, the recording will stop and we'll put cameras back on for those people who are comfortable, and we will do a Q&A at the end of the session.
Okay. All right, so now I'll talk a little bit about the publishing process and where new authors especially come unstuck. So everything starts with a story concept. So I'll give you one example. Two children come of age as they wander through a series of parallel universes. So that is one story concept that applies to the His Dark Materials series, if you're familiar with that. After you've come up with the concept, then what you'll normally do is start planning. And authors there's different kinds of authors here. So I can talk a little bit about my own experience. So I came up with a story concept about 10 years ago. And the first thing I did was start writing. So this would be called pantsing. So other people very carefully plot out everything that's going to be in their novel before they start writing. And it's worth mentioning that traditional publishers will expect for a second or third novel that you have a synopsis you can deliver to them very early on in the process. So even if you're at an extreme of pantsing, you might be pushed towards plotting a little bit more. And there's definitely a good argument for making some basic notes and writing that synopsis as well, because new authors, especially when they're working on a first novel draft, if they pants their way through the novel draft, oftentimes they end up with a saggy middle. They reach a point halfway through where they're just not sure where to go next. So I do recommend doing a little bit of plotting, but equally you have to work with your strengths and what you're comfortable with. For example, I will often pants my way through short stories, but now when I think of novels, I will do some basic plotting and planning. Okay, at some point, you will have a first draft. And if you get to this point, congratulations, you're one of the top 3% of people who have started writing a novel. So most people never finish that first draft. And that was true of me 10 years ago. I wrote about 25,000 words, and then I just stopped writing. I didn't know where to take the story or anything like that. So if you have a first draft, that's great. But a first draft is just that. So some authors refer to the first draft as a vomit draft. And it's a funny expression, but they use that to emphasize that the quality doesn't and shouldn't matter with the first draft. If you're just vomiting words on the page, that's okay, because it's much easier to edit and refine a first draft than an empty page. Despite that, I do think that vomit draft doesn't necessarily do it justice, and this is a point which the developmental editor Sophie Plale mentioned in one of her webinars. I would rather think of it as more sort of unpolished semi-precious stones or something like that. So more work is needed, but there are some really good things in there in that first draft too. The next stage is development, and this is where you want to have your fiction craft books at the ready. If you need any recommendations for those, we can discuss later on. But what you'll be doing at this stage is getting a handle on your weaknesses and your strengths. So I know that my weakness is characterization and certain issues linked to tension in scenes. And I know that my strength is world building. And I've learnt that through kind of sending drafts to friends, working with developmental editors, getting feedback. There's all sorts of ways you can do this. Creative writing courses are also incredibly helpful at this stage. And if you're a new author, I do recommend going slow at the development stage, because really when you write your first novel, you're not just writing a novel, you're also learning how to do creative writing quite often. That is, unless you're moving in from another field that's very similar. So there's a real argument for taking it slow and focusing and learning on what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, without trying to kind of rush to get something out there. So yeah, do not recommend rushing the first novel, especially. Eventually, you'll have a final draft, and that is a draft that you will be happy to send to either a publisher, or you will be happy to self-publish, and so on. So once you reach that stage, all the developmental work, the big picture stuff, like moving chapters around, deleting chapters, that should all be over. And this final draft will just need some kind of polish. That could be a very gentle polish, you know, moving commas around and things like that to make sure that it meets industry standards. Or it could be something a little bit deeper, such as refining the voice, removing sentence level redundancies, like she shrugged her shoulders. Like, we don't need her shoulders. A shrug implies shoulders. He nodded his head, that kind of thing. So Those are the sorts of things that a line and a copy editor can help you out with. Once the text has been copy edited and or line edited, and if you're going for TradPub, first you would expect sometimes the literary agents will do a bit of line editing and tidying up of the manuscript, and then people in-house will look at it before sending it to copy editors and proofreaders who are often, but not always, outsourced freelance professionals like me and Claire. So once that stage is over, you will move on to layout and design. And editors aren't usually involved at all in this step. For fiction, it's usually pretty simple as well. Obviously, it's not if you're writing a graphic novel or if you're doing some very creative things with sentences and how they appear on the page. But most of the time, layout is relatively easy compared with non-fiction here. There's no pictures, diagrams, references, nothing like that. The final step in TradPub, once the text is laid out, is a proofread. And this combines some copy editing skills with thinking about layout that's how the text looks on the page. For example, are the page numbers correct in the right order and so on? Are the chapter numbers and the chapter titles? What about the capitalization? Is all of that consistent? These are the sorts of things that proofreaders will look like. And in many ways, I think proofreading's a more technical skill than copy editing and line editing. So someone described copy editing as wrestling with words and proofreading as wrestling with words in a broom cupboard. And I like that. So really, like, the proofreader's just looking for very tiny things, like small, like typos and things like that. But they also have to think about these other technical aspects of layout. And then after that, your book will be published, and you might think everything stops there, but authors I've worked with in my own experience of publishing is at this stage is often a little bit of an anticlimax, because it's out there, you put all this effort in, and then, usually, unless you're a really famous author with a really big audience, there isn't fireworks and things like that. You basically have to start marketing the book. And you'll either be doing that yourself if you're self-publishing, or with lots of help, hopefully, from a publisher. And the kind of help with marketing that publishers offer really depends on their size and how invested they are in the book. And sadly, they're usually not so invested in debut or new authors. It's usually when somebody starts to pick up an audience in a crowd that they get more interested, unless you're Prince Harry or something like that. Okay. So now the stage where new authors, in my experience, often come unstuck is this stage between having a first draft, which is an incredible achievement, as I've said, and getting towards the final draft. And I'll explain why this is the place where authors often come unstuck. There's lots of different reasons. So first, there's that feeling of celebration, of victory, of having written a first draft, because it is a really big deal. Like I say, not many people make it that far. Oftentimes, but not always, new authors aren't that familiar with the publishing process, all the different steps in it, what's needed, the nuances of like characterization, setting, point of view, and so on. So that means they're often unable to see their own limitations. And this doesn't just apply to writing a novel, this applies to many different fields as well. So there's been scientific studies done on chess players that show that amateur players very often think that they are much more competent than they are. So when you have a small amount of competence in a skill, but some competence, it's very common to overestimate your ability, your competence in that skill. And that's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the words beginner's hubris as well are sometimes bandied around. Now, another reason why authors become unstuck at this stage is that they don't look for a network. So they don't seek help from a network of other writers. Or it doesn't have to be writers, just people who can give them some kind of feedback and help them on their journey with their writing. I've noticed that this disproportionately affects men authors, and I think that's because of some kind of be strong messages which are very prominent in UK and US culture, especially among men, that you should try and be independent, self-sufficient. You can do this, you can do it by yourself, that kind of thing. Whereas authors of other genders and backgrounds often are more used to forming networks and seeking help from others. So that's just something to be aware of. And I've noticed that in myself as well. So 10 years ago, when I was writing a novel for the very first time, like I said, I got to about 25,000 words. And then I thought, oh, I can contact some like literary agents now. Looking back, I had very little knowledge of writing craft, didn't even have a full draft, so I had no awareness of what was really necessary at that point. And of course, I got a couple of rejections. So that's what happens in this situation. But the key is really, if you notice this tendency in yourself, then work on it and seek help from others, get help from others. And that doesn't have to be editorial professionals. That could be a critique group. I live near Edinburgh, and there's a big science fiction and fantasy group there, and so on. So just being around other writers is really helpful and important, because you will be learning from them and becoming more aware of how publishing works, standards in publishing, things like that. It can also be negative, and that will be a topic for another webinar, but some critique situations, sometimes there's people who have egos. Again, if you have limited competence, if you're just starting out, it can be difficult to know who to trust. Who are the people who really know their craft and who don't, and so on. So it's not without its obstacles, but I highly recommend contacting and getting to know other writers, especially those who are working on similar topics and in similar fields to you. Another issue at this stage, and this one's more easy to solve with a few craft books and some internet searches and, consulting friends, is a lack of knowledge about the editing process. And this is something of which professional editors like ourselves, we're acutely aware, because when we start working with a particular client, it's really important for us to know where that client's at, what knowledge they have about editing, what happens to their book, what processes and workflows they have in place. So to give some examples, if someone says they want to query with a literary agent, can you copy edit my text? If their first language is English, that's usually unnecessary because agents are used to receiving unedited manuscripts. They're looking at deeper stuff. They're looking for storytelling skills and wordcraft rather than are all the commas in the right place. So that has implications for us, but it also has implications for why authors might become stuck at this particular point in the process, because they're not sure what the text needs and what the process for getting from this draft to publication might look like. And then there's one final example, and this came up recently for me. I think it's really interesting, but oftentimes new authors, quite rightly, will look at very successful published authors and use them as a model for their own work. So to give one example, there's the G.R.R. Martin. He uses lots of different points of view in his books. And if you look at his books, as he became more successful, there were more and more points of view in his book. After book 3, I think there's chapters where some characters' point of view is it's just there for one chapter, and there's like several characters like this. So a new author might think, oh, this is a great book, I love this book, I'm going to write like this in this style. But the fact of the matter is, writing like that, so people who are very successful, they're much less likely to engage with developmental editing and this whole process because they already have an audience. So in a sense, they don't need to pay attention to things like will the reader become quickly attached to the main characters? Because the readers will keep reading anyway. They're already super invested in these worlds and in this lore. So that's one reason why, and I'm sure you've seen that with lots of very successful authors whose books kind of get ever bigger and bigger as you move further down the series. Readers can think they're a good example, but they're often not. And I would always recommend looking at the first few books that those authors had written rather than the later ones, because that's more likely to be a point in the process where they were listening to and acting on feedback from developmental editors and so on. Okay. So now just to mention like one quick topic that quite often comes up. Beginner authors who are looking for developmental editing often have problems with perspective and point of view. So first of all, I'll explain very, very quickly what this is. And then I'll give you a hint, really, of why it's much more complicated than that. So it might just seem a question of pronouns. What pronouns do you use to tell the story? And there's 3 examples here. The first one is, I woke up exhausted. Those stupid neighbors partying on a weeknight again. Or you could use a second person. So you woke up exhausted. Your neighbors had been partying on a weeknight again, and you were sick of it. Or third person, Ollie woke up exhausted. His neighbors had been partying on a weeknight again, and he was pissed off. So those 3 examples all have a slightly different flavor, but POV is actually much more complicated than that. So if we just take the first person POV, for instance, there's actually 2 different ways of telling a first person story. One is unfolding action in the moment. I woke up exhausted. And the other is more like a memoir where the POV character is looking back on things that happened many years ago. So back in that summer in 2005, I woke up exhausted and so on. And then there's all sorts of things to think about, because if they're talking about the experience from a point looking back, then you know, for instance, that they didn't die in the meantime. And that has implications maybe for tension in some of the scenes in that story. So I just wanted to give you there a little flavor of perspective and point of view. And it's actually, it can seem simple to start with, but it's deceptively complex. Third person as well, because you have different levels of being in the person. Do you share their thoughts and feelings, or are you just reporting like a camera on their actions and things like that? So I'm going to skip the head hopping example, but if anyone has questions about head hopping, ask me at the end, and we'll move over to Claire.
Okay, thank you. So this actually links quite well with what Andy's already been talking about. And what we're saying is that new or beginner authors, early career authors, the things that might trip them up, I suppose, is what we're looking at. So what might trip up a newer author? Well, POV and perspective is certainly one of those things that we've seen trip up newer authors, but also showing and telling. And I think that the issue with showing and telling is that it's so well promoted. And actually, our slide title here, showing and telling, is probably not how you're used to seeing it. You will have seen this on writing blogs and people talk about it on podcasts, anywhere where there's writing craft advice, and you'll often see it being called show, don't tell, with that imperative tone telling you what to not do and to show rather than tell. And as with what Andy was saying there about point of view and perspective, it's not black and white. There are nuances and there are subtleties. And when you get to that, you've finished your first draft and you are reviewing and you are self-editing, showing and telling and deciding what has its place where is a really useful process to go through, so that you can do all of this intentionally in order to make the reader feel like you want to make the reader feel. So you've obviously got, when you're writing, it's not, you've got your idea for, you know, projecting forward. What does the end point look like? Well, project forward and don't just picture that book on the shelf in Waterstones or whatever. Picture that book in somebody's hand, and picture that book and the effect that it has on people and the emotions that you want to prompt within your readers. And when you're looking at showing and telling, and showing versus telling, or showing, you know, where to show and where to tell, that's important to think about which one to use and where and why within your manuscript. So I'm going to use this example here, which I'm using as an example essentially of some things here are definitely what not to do, but there are things in this short extract here that probably could and would get a pass. You know, they could probably stay, but other things would be better removed. So I'll just read it out to you. In the dimly lit alley, Alara clutched the mysterious pendant. This amulet is supposed to change my life, she thought to herself sadly. A wicked-looking blade hung at her side, a constant reminder of the dangerous path she now walked. Sadness flooded through her. The weight of her mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. Calmly, she slipped into the throng of the marketplace, attempting to blend in with the bustling crowd. She knew she must gather information without drawing attention to herself, aware as she was of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Can we just go on one slide, Andy? There we go. So colour-coded now. And as I said, some of this could probably get a pass, but as a line and copy editor, I don't think I'd be giving the words in yellow a pass, and I want to explain to you why. So in the dimly lit alley, Alara clutched the mysterious pendant. You want the reader to be the judge of whether this pendant is or is not mysterious. And there are other words within this opening of this extract that imply that the pendant is mysterious. The mere fact that Alara is clutching the pendant tells us that there's something important about that pendant. So it's significant in some way or another. So the reader does not need to be told that the pendant is mysterious. You know, perhaps that pendant could be more described. Maybe it's got a crack in its surface. Maybe it's got something about its physical description that gives you the sense that it's mysterious without laying it on thick and telling the reader that it's mysterious. Then it goes on to say, this amulet is supposed to change my life, she thought to herself sadly. Again, here we've got the adverb sadly, but we don't need it because this amulet is supposed to change my life, is what she's thinking. Well, you're getting the implication there that the amulet hasn't changed her life yet, and that is a disappointment. We can get the implication that that thought is a sad thought, so we don't need to be told that that thought is a sad thought. So 2 more examples of this then. A wicked-looking blade hung at her side. A wicked-looking blade hung at her side. Let the reader be the judge of it being a wicked-looking blade. What is it about the blade that gives the impression that it's wicked-looking? You know, is it the shape? Is it the design? Is it some sort of inscription? Is it something? Allow the readers to infer and use their inference to decide that it's a wicked-looking blade. And then the last one there, calmly she slipped into the throng of the marketplace. I think for that one, I think it's a case of sort of redundancy because she's slipping into the throng of the marketplace anyway. Slipping, it's not she pushed or she rushed or she barged, it's she slipped. And you've got those soft, sibilant sounds. She slipped into the throng of the marketplace. That already feels calm without having to sort of say that it's calm. So they're the sort of obvious ones there. And yes, I have highlighted, but in a different colour, dangerous, sadness and bustling. So some other sort of emotion words, but sometimes you might feel like they have a past, because that one there, it's a metaphorical dangerous path, I would imagine, a constant reminder of the dangerous path she now walks. We don't need a physical description of the path. It's being used metaphorically there, so it's all right to have dangerous path. Sadness flooded through her. It's up to you. You know, you could describe that, like, what does sadness flooding through somebody look like? Is that something that you can see in their physical actions? Is there something in the shoulders? Is there something in the face? Is there something in the, you could do something with that. I mean, the shoulders are already mentioned there. The weight of her mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. We've got in this extract as well, we've got quite a bit of doubling up. So she's slipping into the throng of the marketplace. So she's slipping in, attempting to blend in, but we already know that she's slipped. So that sort of gives the impression that she's probably trying to blend in anyway. And then it's a throng of the marketplace and it's a bustling crowd. So sort of feel like quite a lot. That's quite sort of overdoing it a little towards the end there. Now, I want to mention the end of the extract because I think it links in well with what Andy was talking about with perspective and POV. She knew she must gather information without drawing attention to herself. Aware as she was of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, how close in are we to Alara? So she knew she must gather information without drawing attention to herself. Feels like an internal thought that we're getting access to. But then, aware as she was of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, feels more zoomed out. It feels like the narrative perspective is further away. And that one there, I had it as an example of, would you leave it or would you not? The dangers that lurked in the shadows, excuse me. That could potentially get a pass, but it depends. For me as a line editor, that depends on whether the dangers that there's something about that aware as she was, the dangers that lurked in the shadow, would that get the green light or not? Depends very much on the narrative perspective and how closely in with Alara we are, not just in this scene, but generally. So that could be a point of view glitch, jar, and that's something that I wouldn't necessarily be picking up on because of the showing and telling. I'd be thinking about it, but I'd be picking up on that for POV and perspective as well. So if we could just move on a slide, Andy. So showing and telling, tells are fine as placeholders. Tells are fine sometimes anyway, because if you had a full novel of show, it would be like reading through treacle. It'd slow the pace right down. So for example, if you had a character and they were looking through a filing cabinet, you might just need to tell the readers that they've skipped past 19 files and blah, 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 blah. You might just need to tell them that, because if you show everything, if you sort of show it becomes painstaking. It's meant to be a quick activity. So sometimes tells are needed, but shows, when you want shows, is when you want your reader to really be immersed in a scene and you really want to deepen the scene. Readers are probably more likely to remember the show scenes, the deep scenes. When you've put the book down, when you finished it, it's those show scenes that will have had the most impact on you as a reader. The tell can just sort of pass you by and it's just getting through the story. And of course you have to get through the story, but there's a difference between the scenes that are just that are experienced, I suppose is what I'm saying. Some scenes are more experienced and you don't experience everything in a story because that's just not actually possible to do. But certain scenes that you really want to highlight, and those are the ones where you want to spend your time to make sure that they are as rich as they can be. So to think about that wicked looking blade, I'm so surprised that actually just about every edit I do has a an X looking something in it. I think surely I'm not going to find it in this manuscript, and lo and behold, I find it. You know, it's a wicked looking this, or it's a modern looking that, like whatever it is. And I feel like it's a placeholder that authors have forgotten to go back to, you know. And also, but that actually makes it a really easy win. If you're on the lookout, and it depends whether you've hyphenated it or not, if you're on the lookout for the hyphen looking descriptions, that's a really easy find and have a, you know, control F, look at it, look it up in your manuscript, and they're really easy ones to fix. So describe what is it that's modern looking or wicked looking about it. Trust your readers. Your readers are intelligent and they want to infer. They don't want to be spoon-fed, and they want to have a more immersive experience. Okie dokie, so that's me for that one. And so we've touched on 2 storytelling fundamentals today. We've touched on POV and perspective, and we've touched on showing and telling, showing versus telling, whatever you want to call it. Now, we offer a coached course that doesn't have a start date. There's no set start date. It can begin whenever you want it to begin. It's a rolling program. So when writers are ready to start the program, day 1, week 1 of the program will be your day 1 and your week 1 for you, for when you want to start the course. So you can book onto this whenever you wish to. So it's called Storytelling Coaching 101, the fundamentals of fiction craft. And if you want to know more about it, then I assume you're in touch with Andy, or you're in touch with me. Feel free to ask more. So I'm not going to overdo this. I'm going to briefly say it's a 4-week course where you have a topic to do each week. You have weekly check-ins with one of us, whoever's assigned your tutor, where you get a 30-minute online meeting with us to discuss each week's topic. At the end of the course, you get feedback on 2,000 words of your own writing, and then you get a Zoom or an online meeting, a 40-minute debrief at the end of the course to go through anything with us that we want to go through as kind of next steps. So to come back to this question, is your novel editor ready, or get your novel editor ready? What we're saying is, when we receive manuscripts, because we both have, we'll be honest, when we've received manuscripts that we've kind of had to go, I've got an awkward conversation to have right now because this isn't actually ready for an edit. And if it's not been ready for an edit, it's usually been for one or more of these 4 sort of storytelling fundamentals. So it's that something's not quite right with showing and telling, something's gone wrong with POV, perspective, maybe dialogue isn't quite there for whatever reason, or there's been an issue with world building. So it's in feeling confident about these 4 aspects of storytelling that should make you as a writer feel ready that your novel is ready for an edit, if you're confident with these writing craft elements. Okay.
Okay, yeah. So, and we put world building there, but even romance authors speak of world building. There's kind of different understandings of it. So in a romance novel, if we want to speak of world building, a lot of that would be internal, and it would be to do with how the different characters kind of approach romantic relationships. Do they, for example, is your character a serial monogamist? That would imply some kind of way in which their mind is configured and how they approach relationships. And that is a kind of world building as well. So just very quickly, I have a free course on perspective and point of view that covers kind of the basics of things that I've mentioned. If you're interested in that or any of these other courses, you can just sign up on my website. And there's some exercises as well on the perspective and point of view course, because I think that a really common problem is that authors will read lots of craft books, but to improve, it's important to have a go at looking for a project, for a problem, and then compare that with a solution. And that's where doing some exercises can be really helpful, because a lot of fiction editing is really about learning to spot particular things. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the main part, for the recorded part of this webinar. So thank you for listening. If you want to work with us or are interested in working with us, we have availability from autumn of this year for edits, or you can do the storytelling course at any time. And that's it. So I'll stop the recording now.
Can I
And
just
then
say
we'll
one
have,
thing,
yeah,
Andy? And
yeah.
that is newsletters. So
Oh,
if
right.
yeah, so I was going to mention my newsletter because I meant to mention it earlier when I was talking about showing and telling. So if you sign up to my newsletter, you get a free resource about looking for negative emotion tells in your writing. You get a list of 15 and what you can look for. So that's a resource that you can see if you go to cherryedits.com and sign up for the newsletter.